right, it is 1 o'clock, so we are going to get started with things right on time. Without any further delay, I will just let our wonderful leader, Rachel Freeman, get us kicked off in our first webinar series for the Collaborators Forum.
Thank you, Erin. So yes, my name is Rachel Freeman. I'm from the Institute on Community Integration at the University of Minnesota. And I'm just one of several leaders within our network. We actually have a whole team that kind of guides this process. It's a unique thing, I think, because in many situations you have just sort of one person kind of leading everything. So I only represent a piece of the puzzle. What I wanted to do, though, is share and introduce 2 speakers today who are really implementing positive behavior support in innovative ways. When we think about this core feature presentation and webinar series, just know the history of it is that it started with an April event that was going to be a full day set of presentations. And unfortunately, the COVID-19 virus kind of messed up our plans. So we've adjusted, and part of it is we've used data and information from all of you about what you want to see to create this 4-part series. We have the Association for Positive Behavior Support Conference coming up in 2021. And our network that you see here, the logo, the Collaborators Forum and the Minnesota PBS network is part of this larger international group of PBS implementers. So what we're hoping to do this year is kind of set the stage for these presentations to lead us to our conference that is supposed to be in Minneapolis, St. Paul, but we don't know exactly what's happening at this point, as I can imagine you all understand. So we'll keep you posted on the 2021, but know that it will be happening. We just don't know exactly what it's going to look like at this point because the board is working on, the plans for adjusting. So as we look at this first slide, you'll see children and young adults 6 to 21. Our focus today is in this range and this area of positive behavior support. And you'll see Kevin Filter and John Beach are our keynote speakers. So they're kicking off this 4-part series, which is really exciting. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that this network really has come together as a way to really think about across the lifespan. We have lots of people implementing PBS in Minnesota. I've had the opportunity to see this growing sophistication across education, human services, early childhood, all of these different areas in Minnesota where PBS is being implemented. Our network is trying to figure out how do we bring us all together. We do have different language, early childhood, adult residential supports for people with disabilities, but what brings us together are some core features of PBS. We also know that good PBS plans include homeschool and community. So no matter what we're doing across universal strategies, tier 2 strategies, or tier 3 strategies, where we're increasing the intensity of interventions, we know that we need to work together at a community level. And so that's what this network is meant to do, is really think about how do we come together. On the next slide, you'll see some of the different logos that represent organizations that are contributing to the network. And it really is a diverse group. I'm very excited to be able to work with all of these folks. You'll see the 9 core features of PBS. We'll be talking about this throughout the different 4 strands of presentations. And you see over on the side, the keynotes in the following areas. So early childhood, children and young adults, which is the one today, adult services, and elderly and aging. So we're hoping that this helps us to learn about each other, come together as PBS implementers, and work on our language of coming together. So as we do that, we want to really think about the larger context that we're in. And if you go to the next slide, what we see is that this is a really important day for us, for everyone. And I was watching the news earlier, and I think that the fabric of our society is really shifting. And we want to really recognize Juneteenth as this important day that we're presenting on. If you have been listening to the news, and some of you know already that this is really a day where the emancipation of slavery was finally announced 155 years ago, this event occurred where the last outpost where slavery was occurring was ended. And this particular day looks like it will become probably a national holiday. We're all hoping that that occurs. If you want to learn more about it, we do have a link that's right at the bottom here that takes you to a number of different types of articles, videos, and Frederick Douglass's like initial speaker oration about this topic. So we just wanted to recognize this as one of the contextual features that bring us all together as a community and a network. And on the next slide, you'll see, you know, the major events that have been occurring that have really created a different way of thinking about how we are in the world. And that International Mourning for George Floyd, the protests that have been going on, and really the knowledge that we have to all of us step up as allies for our people of color, for Black people in our community, and deconstruct systemic racism. So these are the pieces that are sort of the fabric of our work in the network that we have to be building in consistently, and we can't just talk about it. We must actively work on this. If you go to the next slide, you'll see our community has really first great artists, but also the messages that we've seen over the last few weeks really shows us that we as a community can come together, that we care about our community, and that together we can make these changes. Now, PBS has always included this cultural responsiveness strand, but we have to do better. We know this. So as we go to the next slide, the other piece of that big context is the COVID coronavirus outbreak or pandemic. As we think about where we're at today, this is one of the pieces that is really universal across all of our areas. We know that we use the same language. It helps us to communicate across groups. So when we think about early childhood or working with adults with disabilities, we work in education. These are things that we're looking at as far as consistent implementation. We have different links and resources, and we're all kind of moving towards these major messages around defining our expectations, moving that to online sort of venues, practicing our expected behaviors in these different settings, and really continuing to focus on how do we create these familiar routines, whether you're in family settings or in education and adult sort of residential supports, working with children with emotional behavior disorders and other types of facilities. So these are some of the big contexts as we move forward with our discussion about the network and our presentations coming up. And if we go to the next slide, what we're trying to do is kind of tie the presentations you'll see John and Kevin present today, so that they have that unified messaging, so that when we look at no matter where we work, we see the core features of positive behavior support. This article is 2002, and it was one of those first discussions about what is PBS. And so you'll see here changes in lifespan, or changes in lifestyle, working across the lifespan, all the settings that are needed to support people in PBS, involving the people we're wanting to support in the leadership and direction of whatever is going on with PBS, and effective change. You'll see improving outcomes by working together in this tiered model, and then decreasing, the likelihood that problems occur. The last two are really the message that we work across scientific practices, and that we integrate different types of supports, not just PBS, but things like person-centered practices. We wanted to set the stage because all four of the presentations are going to show you what this looks like, these core features across different types of lifespan time periods. And so that's kind of the major goal today. You'll see that some of the language across these core features are shifting a little bit. We're trying to figure out the best way to communicate so that it works for all of our different settings. So this is just the piece of the puzzle to set the foundation for the great presentations coming up. And if we go to the next slide, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just know our state is really dedicated to, well, actually I did the core features. They were in the other slide. So keep going, Erin. This slide here is really the message around person-centeredness. So as educators, as early childhood providers, people working with adults with disabilities, we're all trying to figure out what is the best way to support people as they grow and evolve as people. And how do we do that in a way that really helps people achieve their goals and increases the likelihood they have meaningful lives in the community. So as we think about young children as they move into school sort of settings, or if we think about young adults who are just finishing school and moving into adulthood, we really want to create that life where they have jobs in the community, where they have the opportunity to feel like they're connected, and that we have that equity and support for people so that they can live the lives that they want to live. And if we go to the next slide, I'll make sure I'm staying on time for you guys. I want to give you plenty of time to talk. And the next slide is really meant to say what Kevin and John are doing today is helping to connect our network information. Our team has been really looking at how to show the data, systems, and practices that we're using in a way that helps us connect across the lifespan. I work with adults with disabilities. I work with organizations. Some people are on the call today, I see, who are representing those areas. And we are using the same methods and strategies that you'll hear John and Kevin talking about today. But they do have slightly different focus points. We have different tools. And so this busy table shows you that each of the tiers have the different data systems and practices that we want to figure out how to connect across the lifespan. And so this set of presentations is kind of aspiring to, one, make sure that we're showing you what's happening in our own state around innovative practices, and two, that we have a way to show how our data provides the exemplary aspects or characteristics of what we're doing. We know that a lot of people will say, oh, well, I do person-centered planning, or I do PBIS, or I'm a cognitive behavior therapist, right? So how do we show the fidelity of implementation and the data that helps make those connections so that we know that really this is truly exemplary practice? So that's what this slide's meant to show is these are our first steps in really figuring out how to connect our dots. And John and Kevin will be showing us examples of what this looks like. Okay, so on the next slide, what we have here is just the webinar series. And so, you know, you saw earlier that we're looking at presentations across the lifespan, and John and Kevin are kicking us off. What we want to do is look at the core features, and we have 4, 5, and 6 here. And out of those 9 features, Kevin and John, you will hear them talk about how to involve people supported, how to create effective change, and how to provide supports in a way that shows that tiered model where we're creating interventions for all people, or in this case, students. And how do we create strategies to intervene as early as possible at tier 2 to make sure that we're providing the support people need? And then what do those supports look like when we need to really do individualized intensive instruction? So out of the 9 core features, today you'll see these 3 that are really highlighted, but just know that really John and Kevin have the work representing all of those 9 core features. These are just the ones that are being highlighted today. And as we go through the year, we're going to make sure that we kind of connect all of the 9 features together, but the conversations will be based on each of the areas, early childhood, elderly and aging, residential adult support sort of settings, that kind of thing. Okay, so as we go to this next part, I'm going to get out of the way and let our speakers share their exemplary practice. And the first speaker, Dr. Kevin Filter, he is our keynote speaker, and he's focusing on children and young adults 6 to 21. We're looking at training, coaching, and teaching others in Minnesota how to implement a range of evidence-based school-wide PBS. and then giving back to the international community through APBS articles, participation in conferences. These are all the things that Kevin has been doing, and he is at Mankato State University, and we are really pleased to have him in our state and really making the difference both within our state and at national and international levels. The other speaker that's going to be coming up is John Beach, 19th year as principal at Princeton Intermediate. And you see he's got 750 students, grade 3 through 5. So John's going to be telling us more about his work within the cohorts within school-wide PBIS. And I know John from APBS conferences too. I've run into him. He's got a great business card. It's pretty awesome looking. I don't know if you've updated that, John, but very cool. Anyway, he's worked in Robbinsdale and St. Paul schools as well. And he's been a middle school teacher for 6 years before his principal work, and spent 4 years at the high school level as a student. I like that. Okay, so as we go to the next slide, I think this is where our transition occurs. So I'm really pleased to hand over the reins, and hopefully I stayed within my time, Erin. She didn't prompt me, so I think I was okay. And I will hand it over to Kevin, right? Is it Kevin first?
Sure. Yep. I'll get it started. Thank you, Rachel. I'd say that was perfectly on time. Extremely well done, Rachel. Thank you very much. So I think Rachel gave us a wonderful introduction, so I don't think we need to spend much time rehashing who we are. But I am Kevin, and John is joining me as well today. John and I partner together a lot in training schools to implement PBIS. We've been working together mostly in the South region to train schools, although we've certainly both done work all around the state. So John and I are a longtime team, so I'm super glad to have him with. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go back and forth a little bit. I'll lead a lot of this discussion, but we'll have John jump in at steps to cover some content. And John, do you want to just say a quick hello?
Hello. Pleasure to be here.
All right. This should be a comedy routine at some point. All right. So let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. So we're going to be talking about PBIS, school-wide PBIS. So as many of you know, the I is just kind of a letter we put in there once we scaled it up to school-based applications for some differentiation, and won't go deep into the history of that. But we're talking about application of positive behavior support at the school level, K-12 level. And we'll definitely be talking quite a bit about what happens in Minnesota in particular, but we're very reflective of the national landscape of PBIS. I personally was involved with PBS the University of Oregon when it was first getting started, and then came to Minnesota, and I've been kind of seeing it and participating in it since we got going in 2005. So I've been at Minnesota State University since 2004, and 2005 is the year that Minnesota really invested in implementing it as a state initiative to support schools in the state. So just a quick update on where we're at, an acknowledgement to the whole state initiative. John and I are just a small piece of this system supporting these schools, and we'll give some nods to some other people as we move along. But what we have is we have trained 769 schools in the state of Minnesota through this year. By next year, it'll be considerably more. Majority of those are elementary schools, which is reflective of the overall demographics. There's more elementary schools than middle schools and high schools, but we have some middle schools and some high schools we are supporting as well. At this point, we have trained about 37% of schools in Minnesota. That number is creeping higher very quickly. But also just wanted to recognize that PBIS is being implemented by a lot of schools that have not been directly supported by the state. So there's a diffusion of practice with this. So when we work with schools, we're often finding that they have implemented multiple components of it, and part of our job is tightening it up. So John and I already kind of gave a nod to our role in all of this, but just quickly highlighting where we're at in Minnesota, that graphic on the lower right shows the kind of penetration, the saturation of PBIS in the state. The darker the green, the larger the percentage of districts and schools in that area that have been supported. And then that other graph is something that I'll actually give a nod to in a moment, but basically just suggesting that we are not just training, but we're also training to levels of fidelity of implementation that lead to effective outcomes. All right, so John's going to be running the slides, so let's jump to the next one. John, if you wouldn't mind, I'll just introduce this, but if you wouldn't mind talking through this one really quick, just to get us kind of both going here. But this is the 4 key features of Tier 1 PBIS as explained by Horner and Sugai in 2015, the stuff that we've been working on.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. So in general, we want to really be focusing in on what are those behavioral expectations and how do we define them and teach them, so both to our whole school community, our students, our staff, our parents, our community folks know what those are. Really want to have a system that we can have overall to reinforce what's happening. When we see good things happening, we want to reinforce that positive behavior and just give an appreciation for the things that folks are doing. And then how do we, when we see those things that we don't really want to see, how do we do some error correction in a way that is positive, but also getting the students back on track. And then obviously wanting to use data to help us make the best possible decisions.
Right. So we're going to do a much deeper dive into all of that, actually. That's going to be the majority of our presentation once we get through some of the preliminaries here. But that's just an overview to get us kind of understanding what it is that we do with in our schools when we're implementing PBIS. So the success of PBIS, I think, has been largely attributable to the systems perspective that has been adopted by the PBIS people. There is, in fact, I'm going to make one of the things that I'll be doing in my presentation is kind of differentiating some of those system components and some of those ground level implementation components. But I want to start by kind of recognizing that when we do PBIS, we are really thinking of it from a systemic perspective. We are, for example, if you look at this graphic, I'll try to break down the logic real quickly. But we start with a leadership team. And that leadership team has kind of bi-directional responsibilities. You see there's an arrow pointing upward and an arrow pointing downward. Towards the top is the executive functions of a leadership team. Those are things that ensure the relevance and maintenance of the initiative overall. That's things like ensuring stakeholder support, funding, looking at policy, making sure our state regulations, local district policies, all those sorts of things align for our work, and that we have the capacity to be doing it. And then we have the more direct implementation function, the downward arrow, which basically is the management of the implementation process itself, the ensuring that training is occurring, that we have coaches to support once we've trained, that we're collecting data, and that we have the right people in position to be able to implement these things effectively. And so that team structure, we have it at the state. We have a state leadership team. And then that same leadership logic also occurs at district level. We try to install leadership teams at district level that still follow that same logic. All right, let's jump to the next slide. So in connecting to the themes for Minnesota APBS, which really are the themes of PBS broadly, we were asked to focus on 3 particular elements. We have, or 3 particular features. We had the advantage of doing this first, so my colleagues will be doing other presentations on other lifespan stages. They'll have to identify some core features that they'll emphasize. So I think we took the ones that made sense to us, that fit easily into what we're talking about. And so the 3 that we're going to emphasize, and exact wording it may vary a little bit from slide to slide, don't worry about that, but the logic holds. So one of them involves the people supported, so we'll talk a little about that. Creating effective change, the change matters. And 6, we're providing supports for all, provided by all. So I'll break those down. So let's just jump into the next slide and we'll start talking about that first theme of how we emphasize this theme in the state work and national work we do in PBIS and international work. So first, involves the people supported. We absolutely encourage the involvement of students Students are obviously the most easy to identify people who are supported when we implement PBIS. Although I'll make a case in a moment that we are also supporting staff. They are being supported and receiving some benefits. So the student involvement, we're very explicit in encouraging and ensuring that we have student participation on implementation teams in schools at the secondary level. So when we have high schools, it's actually a required core implementation feature that there's a student member of that team. So they're able to give a lot of support. And honestly, that's a really important stage to have it, because sometimes at the secondary level, we have schools that wonder, well, is there such a thing as acknowledgements or reinforcers that teenagers really care about? Well, let's give them voice. Let's let them have a say. And so they're involved. There's also implementation level pieces, not just the team support pieces. So sometimes we have peer-to-peer implementation components, right? So when we think about acknowledgements and reinforcers, one thing that I've been seeing a really large growth in Minnesota and nationally is peer-to-peer positive acknowledgement systems called tootling, right? You combine tattling with tooting your horn. We're catching each other being good. We're tootling. We're seeing a lot of that. Students helping support students to be to have better outcomes. But the teachers are also part of this process. They are receiving support. And I say that because we can look at the data that show that teachers in schools that are implementing PBIS actually have lower burnout rates and increased rates of sense of efficacy. So we're seeing these positive outcomes for adults. So we are supporting them, and they are absolutely having voice in this process. They are involved in the process. They're on the teams, and every single staff or teacher in a school should have at least annual opportunity to review data and provide feedback. All right, let's jump to the next one. Second theme we're going to focus on is creates effective change. I love this one. This one was pretty easy. I think a lot of us would be happy to have this topic because we all have our data, right? PBS people are good data people. So I'm going to highlight three ways of looking at effective change when we do PBIS. The first graph there in the upper left is a summary of some recent fidelity of implementation data. So when we say create effective change, first thing we have to do is ensure that we're doing what we said we'd be doing in order to be able to say that what we said we were doing makes the difference. So that fidelity data shows that when we work with our school teams over time, and the bottom shows basically 3 data collection points per year, we're seeing this increase in fidelity. And what we're seeing is by midway through our second year of training schools, and we train them for 2 years and then provide ongoing supports after that. By the middle of the second year, we are seeing schools in general hit fidelity. The vast majority of schools have reached the 70% criterion that we're looking for. The graphic underneath is a very relevant local example of a school. That's John Beach's school data. John, do you want to just make a quick comment on what that bar graph shows?
Yeah, sure. So we began our journey back in 2005 and 6, and so it just shows the over time. And this is not a very pinpointed group of data, but it's a nice overview of just looking at number of referrals per 100 students for a given school year. And so over time, you can see we've had some ups and downs, but overall, much more on the positive side of things. That's just one little snapshot that's obviously more important for us to be able to go and then drill down and see what those numbers are made up of. But thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, of course. Excellent. And there are certainly plenty of published studies about effectiveness or randomized controlled trial studies. There's a lot of stuff we can talk about with data. I'm trying to keep it kind of simple and local. So the other one I'd like to emphasize here is some data we had in the state from a few years back, where we looked at a period of time relatively early in PBS implementation, where we saw a substantial decrease in the state in disciplinary incident reports, which is suspensions and expulsions. And we did a dive into that data, or really the state people did a dive. I love showing their data. They did this. And what they found is at the time, we had about 25% of schools implementing PBIS, but those 25% of schools accounted for 62% of the observed reductions in the state in those suspensions and expulsions, meaning you're way more likely to see a reduction in suspension and expulsion in a school if your school is implementing PBIS. So I thought that was pretty cool too. All right, let's jump to the next slide and address the last theme before we get into the details of PBIS and the work we've been doing on it. The last theme, again, wording, you might see different wording on different slides, but the general concept here: provide support for person tied to supports for all, with supports provided for all, by all, sorry. Really what I want to highlight here is the tiered logic. Multi-tiered systems of support is a big thing, particularly in schools these days, although I think it's, it follows a public health logic model, which has been around for quite a while. And when we do PBS, we're very explicit about that. What we're going to highlight today is a lot of stuff about the supports provided for all, by all, which is the universal level of support, the tier 1 level of support. So we are ensuring that all teachers, all staff, all support professionals are involved in supporting all students. But we also ensure that students' needs are met, right? So if they have increased levels of needs, we provide increased levels of supports. So a good implementation of PBS begins with the foundational universal supports that we'll talk about, but we have very explicit systems and processes in order to support kids who are at risk and kids who have significant behavior concerns. So we have tier 2, tier 3. We're not going to emphasize tier 2 and tier 3 in our discussion today, but we do evaluate that and we do support that when we implement PBIS. All right. So the kind of framework for what we're going to be discussing today is taking a broad perspective of PBIS, but it's going to be informed by some recent research happening in the States. So we have a project going right now called Project PACT. And Project PACT fundamentally is about trying to understand the frontline implementer concerns when implementing PBIS, trying to find ways to support staff when they're expected to do all these things that are involved in implementing PBIS. We want to be able to understand, is there resistance to it? Are they supportive of it? And what can we do to support that? So if you can go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more quickly about Project PACT. This is a grant that I'm involved with through the Institute for Education Sciences, which is part of the U.S. Department of Education. It is their kind of research educational branch. And it is a collaborative effort between myself at Minnesota State University, Mankato, and Leanne Johnson at the University of Minnesota. She is the principal investigator. I'm co-principal investigator. And then many of you also probably know Clay Cook, who's also at the University of Minnesota. He is involved as a co-investigator. He is every bit as involved as the rest of us, but that guy gets so many grants, we had to drop his involvement to ensure that we actually got funded. But we're definitely a team of 3, and we also have many other people involved. We have Danielle Dupuis, who's at the University of Minnesota, who helps a lot with our psychometrics and stats. We have graduate assistants on the team, and a key partnership that we have is with the Minnesota Department of Education. So we have Eric Kloos actually participates in almost all of our meetings. So he's been very, very active in helping us figure out how to do this work. So it's a 3.5-year project, and we are just wrapping up the first year. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing in year 1. So the long-term goal of Project PACT is actually to develop a tool that we can use to assess commitment to implement, right? And the reason for that is anybody who's been doing this kind of systems level work with positive behavior support, and particularly in schools and PBIS, you'll hear a lot of talk about concerns with buy-in, right? We want our staff to do this, but maybe our staff don't want to do this. So the idea of resistance. We want to eventually develop a tool that allows us to evaluate resistance and use that to inform supports targeted towards the most effective ways to gain their support. So when we approached this, the first thing we realized we had to do was really delineate some of the implementation expectations of frontline providers in PBIS. So we took this perspective that, well, one of our early goals, the goal of study 1, which is what we've been working on, was to identify, particularly with PBIS, and also check in, check out, which is a tier 2 element of PBIS, but we're not going to talk about that one today. we wanted to figure out what are the practice elements, what are those frontline student-facing behaviors that are required when implementing PBIS. That would allow us to evaluate those things, right? Because if you're concerned about, how many people have heard that, hey, my staff are not too excited about the idea of using reinforcers? In some settings, that's probably not considered at all, where you have mostly behavior analysts. But when you're working with teachers and you're expecting them to be doing praise, and you're expecting them to be delivering acknowledgements through tickets or something of the similar sort, they may not be as excited about it. So we wanted to figure out what are the required implementation behaviors of those frontline implementers. And so to do that, we took a step back to look at everything we provide guidance in when supporting these evidence-based practices like PBIS, particularly at Tier 1. And we realized we need to make this distinction between implementation components and practice elements. So implementation components are all the things that we do that support the adults to do the work, right? These are things like training. These are actions by teams, actions by administrators, the things that face adults that ensure that good implementation happens. The practice elements are the things that are expected of our frontline implementer. These are implementation behaviors that directly face students. When we're doing PBIS, we expect our teachers and staff to do these things. When we do PBIS, we expect our teams administrators to do these things, which are implementation components, and we expect our teachers and staff to do these other things, which are practice elements. And so our first goal was to disentangle those a bit, because we believe they're both important to student outcomes, right? You need to have both in order to get where you're trying to go. The next slide is just going to show a list of definitions for those ideas. Defining implementation components, defining practice elements, and defining who the expected implementers of those practice elements are. I don't know that I necessarily want to read them off exactly, but they're a resource if you want to look at them on the PowerPoint. But again, I think the key idea is implementation components are actions taken by adults. They're adult facing to support adults to do the work. And the practice elements are student facing behaviors expected of frontline implementers. And so our goal was to focus on those practice elements. Next slide. To kind of highlight the distinction between these two things and how we've been traditionally providing support, technical assistance and such through PBIS, is I did a quick look through one of our common fidelity measures. So remember that slide that I showed you early on that showed how well schools are doing in their implementation? And I said 70% is the criterion. We're using a tool called the Tiered Fidelity Inventory to say that. And when you look at the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, it captures a lot of, it's very well designed, excellent psychometrics, expert validated. It is a good measure. But what it does is it really kind of combines both these issues of implementation components and practice elements. And so when we say that a school is at 70% implementation, what we're really saying is we're not saying that the frontline implementers are delivering the services to kids with 70% fidelity. What we're saying is the school has implemented the full range of procedures that are required to do PBIS well. It is in dark blue are things that are really considered implementation components. By the way, is my internet okay? I just got a note on my screen saying, but please somebody give me a chat if I'm having problems with my my stream. If you look at the dark blue, those are the implementation components, things that are really focused on the adults supporting adults. The green is a component of the TFI where we're looking at the direct student-facing elements, and then the light blue is a combination. And so what we see when we say that a school is implementing with fidelity, what we're really saying is we've implemented a lot of the implementation components, the team elements, the data stuff, etc. And what we wanted to do a deeper dive into is figure out how can we study, or how can we support and evaluate whether we're implementing at the student level to the same rate that we're seeing the overall implementation. And just a quick note to that, there was a study in 2013 published by Wendy Ranke and some colleagues at the University of Missouri that showed when they went into schools that were implementing at over 90%, they were still seeing that in the classrooms, the positive to negative interaction ratio was about 1-to-1, right? These are schools that are implementing very high, but when you look at the practice elements, the actual student-facing practices, sometimes it doesn't look quite as good as the big picture looks. So we wanted to kind of study that a little bit. So we went through a process of identifying what the student-facing elements, the practice elements of PBS were. So let's jump to the next slide. This is just a quick rundown of the process we went through, and then we will spend the whole rest of the time telling you what we came up with and explaining them. What are the student-facing practice elements of PBIS? So here's how we established them. We did a multi-round Delphi process. That's basically a process by which you keep going back to experts and saying, how's this look? Tell us about it, until you get consensus. And so in round one, what we did is we brought in some research experts, which are national experts in PBS that include Rob Horner, George Sugai, Kent McIntosh, people like that. And we also had practice experts. So we had kind of two panels. The practice experts were people in the state of Minnesota who had been identified by the state initiative as high-level implementers, generally coaches and school support people who have been doing this for a long time. And we asked them in round one to generate a list of practice elements. What do you think are the core student-facing practices required of PBIS? And so they gave us just a long list. And then by round two, we had reduced that list by looking for similarity and pushed it back out to collect some data on it. In round two, we asked both practice experts and research experts to look at the list we had generated and evaluate each of them based on is it core? Is it really an important practice element? Is it important? I think was the question we asked. We asked them how important, like to rank it compared to other practice elements. And we asked them how variable we thought those things were. Like some people are doing it, some people are not. And then by round three, we had a pretty good sense of what were the practice elements. So we came down to, in the end, we ended up with 5 practice domains that had a total of 16 elements, basically 3 practice elements per domain. I'll show you that graphic in a moment. In round 3, we basically asked them, again, is each one of these important? Should it be included in the core practice element? And then we also asked them, are these elements as worded understandable by both experts and novice implementers? So we tried to make sure that we had the wording right on it. Round 4, we had a virtual meeting that was with these experts where they could help us figure out some measurement things with the tool we're developing. And then finally, we're still in the process of gathering data in round 5, wherein we asked novice implementers, those who have not been trained, if the wording makes sense, right? We're validating the wording to make sure that this tool is usable not only by experienced implementers, but also by those who have not implemented before. So if we ask you to do, in other words, so we want to make sure that we can go into a school of professionals who have never been trained, show them this list and ask them if they understand it. Could you do this stuff? Because we want to know before we even start, do you feel like you could do this? Do you feel competent in this? And this is the list that we're going to start using for that kind of work. All right, so let's jump ahead again. And I promise we're going to get John deeply involved here again in a moment. He's going to tell us a lot of how all these things actually work. But here's the list of what we've come up with. This is where we're at right now. In Project PACT, we have identified 5 domains of practice elements, and each one has 3, and one of them has 4 specific practice elements. And what we're going to do for the rest of the presentation is go one by one. First, we'll go through domain 1, talk about each of the elements. John will give us the good examples from his own experience with it, and we'll work our way through all of it so that we understand what is it that we expect of frontline implementers when implementing PBIS. And these are things that are not, I don't think anybody would be shocked to see them. These are not like revolutionary. What these are is newly validated, right? They're disentangled and validated is what we're working on right now. So let's just go through and we'll talk them all through as we go one by one. So I'll introduce this one quickly and then John will talk about his experience implementing these things. So the first domain we have is proactive initial and periodic teaching of school-wide behavior expectations. This is differentiated from things that we do to remind students of the expectations, things that we do to support kids in implementing the expectations. This is just the initial teaching. How do we ensure that everybody knows the behavior expectations in the school? So this is something we would expect a classroom teacher or other staff member to do. Number one, in the classroom, teach and model 3 to 5 school-wide behavior expectations based on the behavior expectation matrix, which by the way, should have been developed as part of an implementation component, using effective instructional strategies, for example, describe, model, practice, and provide feedback. So that's something we would expect you to do if you're a teacher or staff. The second one is all the same thing, except in a non-classroom setting. In a non-classroom setting, initial teaching and modeling of 3 to 5 school-wide behavior expectations based upon the behavior expectation matrix, using effective instructional strategies. And then the last one is continue to teach and review the school-wide behavior expectations after initial teaching according to a planned schedule. In other words, reintroducing all behavior expectations throughout the year. And again, I just want to highlight that in order to do this, we need to have completed some implementation components. A team should have existed that established 3 to 5 behavior expectations. And now the staff members are expected to teach those. So that's the actual expectation of the teachers, the teaching of those things. So John, if you want to jump into the next slide and tell us a little bit about how we go about doing those things in the school.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. So what I've done was to put together just a bunch of links, just thought it'd be easiest way to do that. So for teacher expectations in the classroom, we typically use a matrix. And so sorry, loading here. What we have is the classroom level guide. And so this is a resource that we use for our staff. So they have the school-wide expectations. So for us as Tiger Pride, respecting myself, others, property, and community, we take those and then create what do the classroom expectations look like around those, and what are the routines? So this is an example, just a generic example that we use to help build our overall classroom routines and teaching those expectations. So what does it look like if I'm working in a group? What does it look like if I'm upset about something? How do I handle those things? So just a really nice framework for staff to be able to use to share the expectations with students in a really formal way. The other link here that we have is just taking and creating a classroom matrix. So you have that information, then how do you go ahead and make that into something that'll work for your own classroom? So along the top, we have what those different settings are, what those different routines are. We also include social emotional skills, because it's a really important component of the instruction of the expectations within the classroom. And so the staff will go ahead and fill those in and make those something that they're teaching not only the first week, but throughout the school year. Kevin mentioned non-classroom, so taking that school-wide expectations and creating a school-wide matrix. And here's one example of that. This is just an example from the cafeteria. And so it looks like this. The idea is you'll take your expectations, and for this example, it's to be respectful, be responsible, be safe. You'll take that, so you have a matrix for every single setting in the school. And for this example, we take out the cafeteria. If I'm teaching the expectations about the cafeteria, I'll take that information, create that into a poster that can be displayed in the cafeteria area. And then it has what it looks like and sounds like and feels like to be respectful, responsible, and safe in those areas. And then what Kevin alluded to is the whole idea of we need to be teaching these expectations. Went the wrong way. Sorry about that. Need to be teaching these expectations throughout the school year. So we'll use our data to determine what areas need to be retaught, how frequent they need to be retaught after the initial teaching. So the first week of school, we want to make sure that we've taught all the expectations as much as possible in context. So if I'm teaching about the cafeteria involving the cook staff, if I'm teaching about the playground expectations, having playground staff involved in that, but then developing what does that plan look like for overall teaching of those expectations. And this just gives you an idea of questions to be asking yourself. How do you get these things taken care of throughout the course of the school year? So how are you going to kick things off to begin with? What will be your plan for training students and staff? And then using your data to determine when do I need to reteach? What do I need to reteach? What seems to be the area that is most in need? And then sharing that with all of your stakeholders. So your community, your family, so they're aware of what it is that you're working with expectations, and being able to make sure everybody's on the same page. And back to you, Kevin.
All right. Yeah, so that was the first domain of practice elements. So what we should be able to do now that we have listed out kind of explicitly based on expert consensus, what are the implementation behaviors expected of those frontline implementers, we hope to be able to recognize A, if it's happening, and B, if there happens to be concerns or resistance to that frontline implementation, what those things are, right? So some staff might be perfectly comfortable doing teaching in the classroom. They might not want to teach school-wide, or some teachers might be resistant to doing this in the classroom because they have their own approach to the classroom. That's interesting. We need to figure that out. So now that we understand the expected behaviors of frontline implementers, we can start to provide better supports and evaluation related to those things. So the second domain that we're going to look at is very much tied to that first domain, and it's about these behavior expectations. So whereas the first domain was teaching, initial teaching, the second domain is about proactive reminding and encouraging students to demonstrate behavior expectations to prevent problem behavior. I think we all know pretty well as PBS professionals, with many of us with behavior analytic backgrounds, telling somebody to do like something once is probably not sufficient to change a pattern of behavior. So there has to be these additional levels to it. So we're going to be looking at how do we not only initially teach and even reteach, but how do we ensure in the moment that those behaviors are more likely to occur? So there's 3 different things that we came up with through this process, finding these practice elements. The first one, anticipate and deliver pre-corrective statements about school-wide expected behavior to students well before routines which may be associated with problem behavior. For example, walking in the hallway, right? The teacher might know that, hey, we have behavior expectations in the class, in the hallway. Students may know them, but they need to be reminded of them before they go do that thing. So that's an expected behavior. That is an important part of doing PBIS. It's not just teaching, it's reminding. Prompting students to exhibit specific behavior expected immediately prior to a situation that may be associated with problem behavior. So this is more of an immediate prompt right before the expected behavior occurs. And then finally, referring to visuals. So when PBS, one of our implementation components is usually developing postable materials that we can put around a school. The job of the teaching staff and the teachers and staff is to refer to those. For example, posters on the wall to review and encourage school-wide expectations. So just directing students to remind them these are the expectations. So those are 3 things that we expect to happen in terms of proactive reminding and encouraging of these behavior expectations.
Thanks, Kevin. So let's have a couple examples of what that looks like to share with you. Tab open problems. Okay. So as Kevin mentioned, really the whole idea is having that, what am I going to be using to help students, I clicked the wrong one, to do those pre-corrections. So I have knowing, I'm going to just speak to it. These are embedded in the whole error correction piece, which is coming later. So in general, what we're doing is if there's an issue in the cafeteria, we have those cafeteria posters that, like I alluded to earlier, where we're looking at the last 3 days have been really challenging. The cook staff have reported back to the classroom teachers saying these students are really having a difficult time walking through the lunch line without being at a level that's appropriate volume wise. And so the teacher will then look at those expectations from that matrix and say, we need to be at a voice level of a 0 or 1. So you can be talking very quietly, but not at a conversational level in the line, so the cooks can hear what you're asking them and they can hear you. And so just the importance of doing that before the event. So right before lunchtime, I'm going to have that conversation with students. Remember, as we're in the lunch line, who can tell me what it looks like to show Tiger Pride going through the lunch line? Just being able to do that in advance, taking the information I have that I've learned of those issues that have been developing within the cafeteria time. So kind of like Kevin's given the hallway example, just very similar, just being able to have that conversation, to be proactive in advance of a situation that has been a trouble area for the classroom.
All right. And I want to restate another core idea of all of this, which is we need to have those implementation components in place in addition to these practice elements, right? So we need to have already decided on our 3 to 5 expectations. We have already had a team that is creating posters and those sorts of things. So those are the implementation points that allow these practice elements to happen. So I don't want to lose the forest for the trees a little bit here by focusing so much on practice elements, but we'll continue on to the next step, practice elements, domain 3, which is acknowledging and promoting school-wide behavior expectations. I will just give you a quick warning on this one. Terminology seems to matter, just from my experience, right? Behavior analysts would certainly like to be able to say, hey, we're talking about reinforcers. But of course, when we implement on a large scale, we don't always know that stimulus will be a reinforcer. Anyway, so we have this kind of technical approach we want to take to it, but we also have to accept the realities of the place where we're implementing. So, the word reward was used for a while. Ooh, boy, that's not a real popular word. I think we can thank Alfie Cohn a little bit from that, but we've got concerns about some of this terminology. So we asked our experts, practice and research, to tell us what we should be calling it, because we know we got to be doing something to acknowledge and support student behavior to ensure stimulus control by reinforcement. So here's what we came up with. Here's what the experts came up with, and we sorted through. Number 1, acknowledge students who demonstrate expected behaviors with praise. Okay. Number 2, acknowledge students who demonstrate expected behaviors using school-wide tokens or tickets. This is actually a little bit interesting because there hasn't been a whole lot of explicit direction from my perspective as a PBIS implementer about, do you have to do tickets? Is praise enough? What we obviously know we need an acknowledgement system, but it varies so much from school to school. Our experts were really telling us you really do need to have some kind of more token-ish system to be doing PBIS to its fullest. And understanding staff's comfort with that is probably a big deal. And then the last one, even going a step beyond tokens, basically turning into a full token reinforcement system, we should support and allow students to exchange school-wide tokens or tickets for tangible items, social activities, and privileges. In other words, we need to have backup reinforcers, and we need to have a process by which the exchange occurs. But again, that's me kind of overlaying my own language on top of it. But these are the worded languages that we feel will fit in the setting. So hopefully John can tell us a little bit about his experience with
thanks,
that.
Kevin. So I want just to reiterate that the Tiger Paws, which we have, or the token system, are really just tools that we use. And they're just as much for the staff as they are for the students. From my perspective, it's not about the Tiger Paw. It's about the relationship that I'm creating with the student. It's a way of appreciation. So when, like Kevin mentioned, people get hung up on the term reward, really it's about, I'm thanking you. We all like to be appreciated and recognized for the things that we do. And so this is a way for us to structure that by simply saying, taking that tiger paw, I really appreciate the way you walk down the hallway today, respectful to those around you, just having that behavior specific praise that we can connect with students. So people get hung up on thinking of it as a reward, but really we're just showing our appreciation. So I have a couple examples I'd like to share with you along those lines. So just a few ways that we've done this. As we do have tiger paws, like I had mentioned. And like Kevin mentioned, we take those tiger paws and they can be used to do shopping. So they're kind of used as a currency. What we've done is had just different colors for different trimesters. Real simple to have the tiger paw being used. Again, it's a way of an appreciation, and those students can take those and use those at our school Tiger Pride store. Now you can determine how you want to use that currency, what you want that to be used for. And so as any economy, you might have to adjust pricing based on supply and demand, but anything from super simple things like a pencil, be able to sit a certain area in the lunch line or whatever, to being able to have an opportunity to come into my office and eat with me and a friend and watch something together. So just a fun way to be able to acknowledge the positive things students are doing and have them be able to do something with them. Some schools just simply will do a drawing every so often, and those things are fine as well. Just finding ways to recognize and appreciate the work the students are doing. One thing that we also have done is students who are drawn a tiger paw in their classroom, they can have their name put on this wall by our office, and we spin this wheel every couple of weeks and come down and receive an additional incentive. We also have those tiger paws that can be used for substitute staff and from on the bus. And they're slightly different tiger paws, so we can kind of keep track of where they're coming from. We've also taken those sub-tiger paws and drawn separately and had students be part of a subway sub-party. So the sub-party is another way, just another incentive. One of my favorite things is being able to do these good news calls of the day. So any staff can use this Google form and nominate any student. We make lots and lots of phone calls. We do a few Snapchat filters for some fun. We email those home. We call home and tell them the good news, whatever it might be for that particular child. And then email those photos home and also give the student a chance to speak as well. We do a Tiger Pride Cafe. This is for sometimes folks say we don't recognize those students who are continually going above and beyond. So this is an opportunity for staff to nominate students to be at the Tiger Pride Cafe. We have staff do a talent, showcase something that they have as a hobby or something. We do some treats out there, which is a commons area, so a little bit nicer dining experience in the regular cafeteria during that time. And then ending the year, except for this year, with a carnival. Just a fun way to have an end of the year celebration for everybody. Also near the end of the year, and this was last year, not this year, so, but last year we were able to have graduates come in who are the graduating class of 2019 and be able to just show them this is what you're working towards, this graduation experience. So the Tiger Pride efforts that you're doing now will help lead you to being that lifelong tiger. Now, I just wanted to share with you a resource that was shared with me several years ago. This is a book. If you've heard of the behavior doctor, she's put together this book that she's willing to share that really revolves around different ways of acknowledging students. And even though she put some things in there that are things, in most cases, they're activities, they're relationship building things that students are find most valuable. So some good resources there. Hopefully you find something there that speaks to you.
All right. So I assume nobody's going to doubt now that John has created an incredibly positive school environment. He goes above and beyond to create those reinforcing activities for kids. It's so cool. Always love highlighting everything John does, but hopefully you feel how positive that school becomes when we do all this work. All right, so moving into our fourth domain, this is about responding to student behavior that is inconsistent with school-wide behavior expectations. Some other ways you might think of this as behavior violations, discipline problems. When a problem behavior occurs, how do we deal with it? And what we have now is three particular practice elements related to that. Three things we can differentiate in terms of expected behaviors of the frontline implementers, and we can evaluate their perspectives on it. 1, use the school-wide agreed upon definitions for major and minor incidents to determine how to respond to student behavior. So this assumes that the implementation component of creating those two definitions, majors and minors, has already occurred. Now the frontline implementer is expected to use those definitions when they respond. So again, that's that kind of differentiation between implementation components and practice elements. Number 2, use timely, specific, and progressively more intensive instructional methods to respond to minor student behavior incidents. It is a challenge in wording to try to find the right way to say, respond while being as minimally punitive as possible, right? So trying to find that terminology to basically emphasize the instructional logic, right? Not basically saying, hey, this is the way we expect you to act in that situation, and give them opportunities to practice the correct behavior. That's really what we're trying to emphasize there. And then finally, refer major student behavior incidents to an administrator or designee. You'd be surprised how much discussion goes into, okay, is administrator the right word? Can we say send them to the office? This is what we landed on. Refer major student behavior incidents to an administrator or designee for processing and addressing in accordance with agreed upon school-wide procedures. So put simply, number 1 is use the major minor system created by your school. Number 2 is use an instructional approach to responding to violations. And 3 is major violations, go to the office. So John can break that down a little bit for us.
All right, thank you, Kevin. So as Kevin mentioned, there's a large discussion about how do you determine the majors and the minors, and have that discussion with your staff. Then once you have that figuring out what is the flow going to be. So what it will look like when the behavior does happen. And so let me just share this with you. Just a one-pager here. So schools have to determine, once they have that major minor figured out, what is it going to look like? So a behavior happened. So it's a staff member notices the behavior happened. The person noticing that behavior needs to figure out, is that a major or is that a minor that we decided upon as a staff? If it's a minor, I'll go through these steps. Which of these things make the most, is most appropriate to have that behavior be reduced or stop? And so it might be using eye contact, it might be redirecting, it might be ignoring, it might be just simply walking over that student. If that works, great, just keep on working on building relationships, encouraging that positive behavior, using your tiger paws, just keep going as you were. If it doesn't improve, then what are those next steps? What are the things that we've agreed upon that we will do to help correct those errors of behavior? And so there's a 5-step process in this example. So we're super trying to keep that relationship positive. So respectfully addressing the student, just letting them know what the inappropriate behaviors that they witnessed, describe, couple that with what do you want to see. Then link that back to the matrix, whether it be in the classroom or school-wide, and then redirect them back to the appropriate behavior. And then not listed here, but once you see that again, when you see that done positively, acknowledge that. Notice it once you've asked them to make those positive decisions. If that still does not work, looking at a higher level of support, that may be working with your grade level team. It may be working with the student assistance team, or looking at the tier 2 supports you have available for in your school. It could also mean that's when you might go into that office discipline referral. And then if you notice the behavior is automatically a major type behavior, that's when you go ahead and whatever the system is you have for your school, let's write that referral up. That goes to the principal or whoever the person would be. But the key part of this whole thing is really teaching that expected behavior. These opportunities, when we see this inappropriate behavior, it's really an opportunity to build relationships, to reteach expectations, and just help to support the student be successful. It's not about finding more consequences or more harsh consequences. It's really about teaching and helping the student grow in that situation. The other example here, for sake of time, I'm not going to show it, but it's just an example of an office referral form.
All right. And again, just kind of keeping this onto a bigger view here, all the forms and such that John has that he's showing us, these are all the things that are expected to be developed as implementation components, right? It's the adults supporting adults is creating those forms, is creating the behavior expectations. Those are implementation components. And then those things are required in order for us to have the practice elements, which is these frontline implementer behaviors. So here's our last domain of those frontline practice elements. And this was a kind of a controversial one. We were trying to figure out the data piece because what we were learning through the process is data matters, but data is generally a team-based process. The team reviews the data, the team in a school makes a decision, but there are staff elements to data. We're expecting them to help us collect the data. So we have a domain that's called completing data that is used to facilitate decision-making. And please keep in mind that it was all these experts that gave us these ideas and we were just trying to synthesize them. I think these were really interesting. So first is complete office referral form for major incidents. So when there's a major violation, fill out a form. Number 2, participate in data collection to inform which students may need intervention beyond Tier 1 support. So this is screening. Who needs more intensive support? The adults in the school are expected to collect that data to help us decide. 3, participate in fidelity and outcome data collection when asked by administrators or other staff, right? If we ask you, are you doing these things? Or we ask you, what are you seeing? Perception, those sorts of things, that would be something that we expect our staff to do. And then finally, we also expect them to facilitate student completion of data related to PBIS, particularly climate stuff. There's a lot of climate surveying that happens in PBIS. So this last domain is definitely rated as being probably the lowest importance by our respondents, but important enough that we don't want to lose it. So we should be collecting data so that the team can make decisions about those data.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so we showed you that data graph earlier on that just had overall behaviors and so on. I'm just going to show you this, just one thing here. Once we have that information into our system, we've used the school-wide information system, or SWIS. It helps us take a look and see, and it divides up into different categories. So I have referrals, average referrals per day, per month. I have referrals by what the behavior is, by location, by time, by student, by day of the week, by grade. This will help me start to have a discussion with my team, or with our team, to figure out what's our next step. It looks like we have issues with disruption, defiance, and inappropriate language. Looks like the majority of those things are happening in the classroom. There's a handful of students who seem to have the majority of referrals. I can now take that initial thought of what that data is, and then go back in and start looking at what are the referrals that are just disruption, defiance, inappropriate language, that are just in the classroom, that are just grades, whatever. It allows me to then start making some decisions to figure out what are my next steps. And as Kevin alluded to, one thing that we like to do, I have some things we're not going to go through, is to give surveys to our staff. So there's a climate survey that we've used for both families and students, but the student one helps us gauge and take a look at what are the perspectives of the students. So if we're seeing inappropriate language or disruption, are the students, one of these questions in here have to do with the teachers being able to teach. So what do students feel about that particular item? All right, so yeah, I think all that's what I want to touch on. Thanks, Kevin.
course. And thanks, John, for coming up with all these wonderful examples. I really like the way this format was. The Minnesota PBS network had really kind of encouraged us to team up on this, and so glad that we did. Very cool. Okay, so to summarize, we're almost at the end here. So I want to restate what we've really been talking about is some new efforts to delineate the student-facing practices expected of adult implementers in schools. These are the things that we should be able to tell staff either before we implement or as we continue to implement, that these are the expected behaviors. We expect you to do this. Now, expectations on the implementation team are those implementation components. We need to generate, a team needs to be creating forms, needs to be reviewing data, needs to be dealing with all that stuff that I put on that early slide that talked about the leadership team. So we've got these two required elements that fit together to lead to positive student behavior. And we're hoping that the efforts going forward is that we'll have more clarity on what we should be telling teachers and staff is expected, that we should be able to inform them before they even do it, that, hey, here's the road we're going down. We should be able to structure our professional development more directly at the staff level for these things. So, a lot of the training John and I do are to train teams, and that'll stay the same, but we're hoping these teams will now have more guidance to bring back to their staff to say, here is what we expect you to do and how we're going to support you to do each of these things. We are in Project PACT going to continue to develop a measure that looks at commitment to implement these things, but I also have a graduate student who's creating a fidelity of implementation measure for the practice elements. So hopefully within a year or two, we will have a validated measure of frontline practice element implementation with PBIS, in addition to our larger framework that we already have for evaluating PBS, which is things like that TFI that we showed earlier. So we're just hoping to add more to how it is that we can support the frontline implementers, those teachers and staff who are so critical to the actual quality of the supports that we're providing in our PBIS. So PBS is an effective approach to supporting student behavior in schools, certainly birthed out of our PBS movement broadly. I wish I had time to really talk about some of that history. My advisor, Rob Horner, being very instrumental in all those early developments. But for time, we're just going to say we're part of the big picture. And I've always enjoyed connecting with the broader PBS community through these efforts. Second key point at the end here is PBS requires work across multiple levels. We need teams, administrators, and coaches to manage the implementation components. And we need teachers and staff to manage the practice elements. And then relating to those themes again, we do involve those supported. Both the teachers and the students have voice in the process, even at tier 1. We create effective change. We showed you some of those data. Hopefully those were exciting to some people. And we provide supports to all, provided by all. So all students receive Tier 1 PBS and they're supported by all staff in the building. So it's not just one person is doing PBS for the kids or 2 people are doing it for a few kids. When we do PBS in a school, everybody's involved in supporting all kids and meeting their needs across various levels. I think, is that all we got? That's all we got. So John, did you want to say anything quick to wrap up?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to share. It looked like in the chat was these materials. So, if something comes up, we have a question, reach out to us and we'd love to be able to chat with you about it.
All right, thank you, everybody. I think we'll hand it back, to Rachel, right, to wrap it up. And I look forward to connecting with all you guys more in the future.
Thanks. And I know, Erin, you're going to shoot the slides up for me, right? As Erin's putting the last few slides up, the thing I wanted to share as I was listening to John and Kevin is that what we're learning in the Minnesota PBS network is these presentations are so helpful for all of us, irrespective of our organizations that we work in. So, we reflect a lot of different types of education and human service systems. But what we find is when we have these conversations across groups, and I see I have to call out Nicole Lind because she's on this call, I think. And I just want to recognize her from RSI, which is an organization that supports adults with disabilities. What we've found in some of the presentations like this one is that those of us who are in different types of organizations can see these upper level themes that Kevin and John were talking about. And I wanted to hit a couple before the end here. We just have a few minutes. And one of those is relationship building. So if you work in adult services with people with disabilities and you use the word token reinforcement or token economies, you have this language response that's really dramatic because it has some connotations from past history of being used not in the greatest way. And the challenge that makes this unfortunate is, and I think Kevin and John did such a nice job talking about it, is really those strategies like token economies are meant to teach the value of relationships and create prompts for us as adults so that we remember to engage in those relationship building strategies. And Kevin said something really nice, which was, it's not always clear to us whether it's the token itself or it's the actual act of forming these relationships between people. What works really well in schools around the token reinforcement systems is that you have this time period to establish these rhythms and understandings of relationships. So I really like that part. The other piece that I think for those of us in other organizations that we look towards is those tools that you use to help us as adults teach social interaction patterns that are positive. And when I saw John's example around the classroom management, specific matrix examples around what do you do in the classroom around coping skills, around expressing yourself, these things transfer over to all of our different organizations and systems. So I really liked, as I listened to this, I'm actively always thinking about how this fits across our different lifespan sort of areas. The other piece is the data, as John and Kevin talked about database decision making, and really thinking about how we all participate in the documentation and the interpretation of data, and how important it is to teach those skills and support our teachers, our practitioners, all of the folks involved in PBIS in participating in the database decision-making process. So I was looking at, John, one of your graphs, which was the office referrals per 100 students, and thinking about the work that, for instance, Nicole does in RSI, and how 15 years of data that you can share of this progress that you're making over time. These are the kind of things that you transfer in adult services. We talk about incident reports, so we don't use the word office referral. So these different terms and language can throw us off and make it harder for us to communicate with each other. At the same time, as we continue to learn about what we're doing across the state, I think that that's going to break down some of those issues and make it much easier to talk about. If we're doing a PBS plan and we're supporting a young person who's about to go live in the community with a roommate, like what are the things that we can naturally transfer from the work that you're doing so that it's easier, and that the support net is in place for those of us who support people across those transition periods. So I just thought, as you were talking, I was thinking about these things, because I think that's the value of these network conversations. And I look forward to figuring out as a community how we continue to kind of make those connections as we go. But if we go to the next slide, Erin has those up. Just know that these core features that, and I actually, as I was thinking about your presentations, Kevin and John, I was thinking that you really covered most of the core features. You have a certain age range of students, but you also support adults. And so in some ways you can argue that you're working across the lifespan in that respect as well. The things that we do in PBS to support people. And then changes in lifestyle, I think those skill sets in the matrix that you're working on, helping students develop over time, those become another piece that helps change lifestyles. So anyway, I just thought it was interesting. I'm excited to see our next presentation coming up. And so hopefully some of you will come visit some of the presentations that aren't naturally in your area, because I do think That's been one of the things we've learned over time, is that, you know, we were I can't remember which year it was, Aaron, but we had a Collaborators forum with our early childhood folks, and they were showing specific tools that could transfer really easily. And so I remember having a conversation with you and others about how awesome that is, because the evidence-based research that we look at comes out across different areas. And you see items 8 and 9 on this slide really exemplifies that. So even if we're working in adult services with people with disabilities, or we're in mental health, these kind of measurable theories and processes can integrate really well as we kind of look at how do we improve quality of life for people across the lifespan. So with that, just know that you have June, August, November, and January, and I think we changed the dates a little bit. Is Garrett, are you on? Is that right still?
Yeah, it's looking accurate. August, November, and January should be our next dates. So
Okay.
look for those on our site.
So yep, look for those on our site. And I see in the chat, we've got the links for everything up. So we're in good shape, and a big thank you to all the logos at the bottom. In particular, University of St. Thomas. Aaron, you've done a fantastic job getting us up and rolling on these virtual presentations. So again, a big thank you to everybody. And I think we have one more slide, right, Aaron? Just know again that the International Association for PBIS is supposed to be in Minneapolis, St. Paul this year. I know that they're currently looking at, you know, what are the possibilities of going to a virtual platform for the conference versus having maybe a small conference and a virtual conference at the same time. And none of those things I think are worked out yet. Is Tim Moore on the, Tim is on the committee that's talking about all of that stuff. So Tim, are you still here? Maybe not. Okay. So just know that March 17th through 20th. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just looking at the list. He's not still here. So.
Oh, he dropped off. He was here earlier. So, so yeah, March 17th through 20th, that's our International Association. By the time we get to our January strand, hopefully we'll be connecting all the pieces and giving you lots of more information about that conference. So I really appreciate all of the time that you've spent, and I really have a big thank you to Kevin Filter and John Beach for presenting and being our kickoff presenters for this strand of presentations. So thanks. And with that, we can close. We got a few minutes if somebody in the chat wanted to throw out a question that you want to check in about. If not, we will close.
Yeah, you can, if people would like, you have the to ask a question. Otherwise, we can look in the chat.
Yeah, I think John and I are happy to answer any questions for a minute if you want, or the rest of the group. Otherwise, thanks everybody.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. You all did fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Aaron, thank you for all your work on this. You are a master of Zoom.
I've been perfecting the craft lately.
And YouTube.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, are we still running live on YouTube there?
Yeah, I'm gonna stop.